it's colorblind if you're like Clarence Thomas and your whole ideological perspective involves gouging out your own eyes. Like that, and that's what Thomas is. Like, he is such a mutilated version of a black justice that he is able to make these proclamations that just fly in the face of law and facts, right? One of the other things that you really realize when you read through his concurrence is just how angry he is at Ketanji Brown Jackson for having the temerity to be another black person on the Supreme Court. He apparently thought that he got to be the only one. He thought that he had pulled up the ladder for everybody else, right? And so he's really like, he basically throws a tantrum at Jackson. And why? Because Jackson is making the actual originalist argument in the affirmative action case. She is the one pointing out that the 14th Amendment was done explicitly for racial restorative policies like affirmative action, which, as I said yesterday, the first time that happened in this country was during Reconstruction. So this is the history that Clarence Thomas ignores, and that's why he's so fabulous about all of the stuff that's in his concurrence. He's just like plucked out his own eyes, and he doesn't want to see anything that Miss Jenny tells him he shouldn't be able to see.
Well, we saw a lot of very stupid people talking on television this week, and I don't think that's ever going to actually end because we sort of incentivize the morons to talk more. Sometimes they even put them on television together and say, no, have a conversation that completely undermines the argument you're trying to make. That's what Joy Reid and Chris Hayes decided to do this week on the issue of affirmative action. Now, if I'm for affirmative action, I don't want Joy Reid saying I'm an affirmative action hire. Kudos for the honesty, but I don't think it helps the cause. And you're probably going to agree with me here in just a minute.
Well, let me just be clear. I got into Harvard only because of affirmative action.
Everyone knows that. Anyone who's ever watched your show knows instantly that you were not qualified to get into Harvard except under affirmative action. And we all know this. We can pretend if we want to, but we talk like adults here on this particular program. The standards are lowered depending on what your background is. And yes, we all know you wouldn't have got there otherwise. I know you have a problem with that. It's a chip you carry on your shoulder, but at least you admit. So Joy Reid, I'm going to start by saying something I normally don't do. Congratulations on being honest for once.
I went to a school no one had ever heard of in Denver, Colorado, in a small suburb. I didn't go to Exeter or Andover. I didn't have college test prep. I just happened to be really nerdy and smart and have really good grades and good SAT scores. But someone came to Denver, Colorado to look for me. A Harvard recruiter flew to Denver, and I met up with her at the Village Inn restaurant and did a pre-interview to pull me into Harvard.
So they went and they sought you out, someone who was not qualified, and took you to Harvard. Meaning you took the slot of somebody who was qualified based solely on the color of your skin. And I don't blame you at all for being in favor of that or wanting more of that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's self-preservation. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But again, it's nice that you're admitting that you had no business being there. I mean, that comes up a little later.
I was pulled in, and the schools like Harvard and Yale that I got into affirmatively. Yes. And it was literally not saying we're going to take an unqualified person and put them in Harvard. Yes. We're going to take a very qualified person who we would never know existed and put them in Harvard.
That's not true. You just apply, and they know you exist. They're taking a less qualified person. There's no other way to look at it. And unless we admit that, we can't have a serious conversation about it. You're taking a less qualified person and you're putting them into Harvard. And that gave you a leg up. And by the way, you've benefited from your race your entire career. The stuff you did and said on that website that you lied about and said was hacked by time travelers, and the FBI was looking into it, which is a complete lie, you never would have got away with that if you were a white host. Sorry, that's the truth. And we all know it. Period. You got special treatment again because of the color of your skin. Your entire show is based on the fact that you are a black woman. And yes, guys like Chris Hayes will sit there like dorks and listen to this nonsense and nod along and laugh and act as if it's hilarious and things like that. But he knows it too, and so do you.
That's how I got there. That's how Ketanji got there.
There is no question that that's how Ketanji Brown Jackson got on the Supreme Court as well. Joe Biden said, we're going to get a black woman. All he had to actually say was, we're going to get a qualified person. Instead, he specifically said, we're going to find a black woman. That's job number one, was finding a black woman. And again, you've benefited from the same thing. Now, the next thing she says I think is pretty important, and if she was smart, this would be the focus of her point.
It's how Justice Jackson, I should say. Justice Jackson got there. It's how Clarence Thomas got there.
Okay, all right. That's actually a pretty good point. Clarence Thomas, was he an affirmative action person who was allowed into Harvard for that reason? I think he ended up going to Yale, though, but that's beside the point. Was he an affirmative action hire? Was he an affirmative action student? Probably so. But was the world different at the time? And this, I think, is the broader point here that I think people might want to pay attention to. People, including Sandra Day O'Connor, a Supreme Court member, who allowed affirmative action to stand after a Michigan case about 20 years ago, said that this can't go on forever. Things have changed. We should probably knock it down now, but we're going to let it stand. But it will come down eventually because it's unconstitutional. She said that. I mean, that was the gist of her argument. Not in those exact words, but that was the gist of her argument. And everybody knows it. And now the chickens have come home to roost, and they're acting surprised. The world's different. Clarence Thomas has admitted that. Joy Reid, Ketanji Brown Jackson, as Clarence Thomas pointed out, almost fetishize the past and pretend they're still living there. Joy Reid has some other dumb things to say. I know that will blow you away.
Right. But the minute I arrived from my majority black little town, Montbello in Denver, to Harvard, the first week or two that I was in class, my presence was questioned by white people. I was in this big conference class where some white students stood up and said, those students, the black students, they're only here because of affirmative action.
Okay, first off, I question whether that happened, but that is merely an outcome based on how and when I was raised versus Joy Reid. Although she doesn't look much older than me, she is, in fact, much older than I am. That may have happened. Let's just concede that it happened. But it's also a very important story here. That student felt comfortable standing up and accurately pointing out that you shouldn't have been there unless it was for the color of your skin. I don't know if that was true with all the other students that you say he was pointing to, but with you yourself have admitted that it's accurate, but he shouldn't have done it. Maybe you're right. What would happen to him if he did it today? What would happen to that student if he did it today? Thus, further proof that the world has changed, which again is a broader point in this entire conversation.
It became a huge argument that we all ended up having. This was freshman year. I had never had my academic credentials questioned. I had never had anyone question whether I was intelligent until I got to Harvard.
Again, you're just telling on yourself. I never had my intelligence questioned. You're an imbecile. How in the world have you not had your intelligence questioned? You are clearly one of the dumbest people on television who is there by affirmative action. They're afraid to fire you. They know that Al Sharpton, who they also employ so he'll please not call the network and company racist, they know it. They know exactly what's going on, and so do you. I've never had my intelligence questioned until I got there. Yeah. Because you didn't deserve to be there. Again, you're making the argument that you didn't deserve to be there because you didn't deserve to be there.
And it was a defining point of my experience there. It's why I really was one of the many reasons I was miserable there my freshman year. Yeah. You felt completely out of place, and people keep telling you shouldn't be here. And yet, some of the people I went to school with were far less smart than me or the other black folk there. They got in because their daddy and their granddaddy. I went to school with somebody whose name was on one of the buildings. You're going to school with people whose names are on the buildings, who are third and fourth generation legacies, whose parents pumped money into Harvard to get them in. But that affirmative action is okay with this.
Well, it's not actually affirmative action. That's an important part of this. The schools take money in order to keep them functioning for all students. And yes, part of that is a trade-off when it comes to legacies. I agree. I absolutely agree that this is a problem. And you know what's funny about that? One, you don't want them to get away from legacies, because that will cost these schools a lot of money. Not that Harvard needs it, don't get me wrong. But traditionally, that's how it worked. The Asian American students who sued have argued against legacies time and time and time again. This is just a convenient argument you're making right now. The students who benefited from this, if Joy Reid knew anything, or Chris Hayes, the yeah guy in this video, knew anything, he'd say, well, they were against legacy admissions as well. I can at least argue that I can see why you'd want to have affirmative action at least 20 years ago. I can make the argument why you'd want to look at socioeconomic right now. I still think it's wrong, should be off merit, but I can at least understand the argument. This, I think, is the problem that these guys generally have. They can't even pretend to understand the argument the other people are making. They just see their argument, everyone else is wrong or evil or hates black people or some nonsense like this. But Joy Reid can't even understand the argument for legacies. I can. Don't like it, but I can see it. She pretends she can't see it. And because she's an affirmative action hire at NBC and an affirmative action admittee into Harvard, she probably can.
This majority. They said that the people who benefited from slavery, their descendants, who are so far ahead of black folk in terms of opportunity that we'll never catch up to them. I don't care how many Oprahs we get. Those people's affirmative action is A-OK, because those people can pay for fancy trips for them. Yeah. But you people who want to get in just because of your brains, but you're not from a legacy, too bad. You can't come in.
Well, actually, I think the point is you didn't have the brains in order to get in there, and that was the problem. And that's, of course, what your issue was. But, I mean, I don't expect you to be honest about that or anything else. Joy Reid is a lying fraud, and she will continue probably being a lying fraud as long as she is on television. But she made a decent point in the beginning of this video, and that point was, I didn't belong there. Then she got mad because people told her she didn't belong there. And then she went after people who were legacies. And that's fine. I mean, again, I completely understand why you might be mad that a legacy might get in there and not be as smart. That's an issue as well. It should be based off of merit. But I think if you actually did affirmative action and you actually had it, I don't know, look like the country, if this was really the goal here, and it was the number of people, then maybe you might have an argument. But when you are taking people and penalizing them for their race and then benefiting other people for their race, and it skews the entire thing, well, there's a real problem. And in fact, you're having a problem people getting into Harvard based on their grades who are white because people like Joy Reid and legacies. So that's hurting people who have the skills, who have the merit to get in there based on those two things she's talked about. So she's actually kind of right on the legacy thing, but I can make the argument that legacies actually make a lot of sense. Joy Reid can't make the argument for any point she does not already hold because she is terrible at what she does. But, again, if you wanted someone to argue against affirmative action, you could just play that clip of Joy Reid on MSNBC.